So yesterday you mentioned you are a cautious optimist. Why is that? And given the domestic challenge and the international cooperation challenge, do you think that can be done in the medium term?
I'm optimistic because there's been much to worry about over the last generation, and yet we've seen remarkable progress. We've seen huge changes in the way people live around the world, especially nowhere more than in China. And I believe these trends can continue. But I'm worried. I'm worried because it's increasingly difficult to generate sustainable and rapid growth in economies like China as they mature and as imbalances develop. I worry because of a kind of surly nationalism and anger that is in the politics of countries like mine and countries in Europe. And so I think it's going to require great creativity and new approaches if we're to maintain and enhance the momentum of growth, and if we're going to create a situation where everybody has a chance to share in that growth.
You mentioned three modes of operation. One is managed internationalism, or say responsible nationalism. That looks to be what China has been doing. So maybe U.S. is adjusting a little bit to have the responsible nationalism?
Well, I hope that responsible nationalism can become a common doctrine, and that as each country pursues a responsible nationalism, we can have a managed internationalism. And that's a rather different thing than a kind of indiscriminate commitment to trying to make everything in common, to trying to set aspirations that are ahead of what is politically feasible and sustainable. I think people need to feel that their governments are looking out for them rather than looking out for an abstraction of a common humanity or a common international.
So this year, I think one of the major things in China is this One Belt and One Road summit. How do you look at this initiative, and do you think this can be made to success, rather like the Marshall Plan?
I think the One Belt, One Road initiative is a hugely visionary and important initiative. I think it responds to concerns globally, China's desire to ultimately integrate the route that Marco Polo took across Asia to Europe. I think in an even broader way, it responds to China's desire to be a constructive and active player on a broad global stage. At the same time, it also responds to domestic imperatives in China, how to put to use substantial unused capacity in the materials sector, how to put to use substantial unused capacity in construction. So I think it's a project that has great potential. And I think the question will be is, in what spirit is China carrying it on? Is China doing it in order to promote a common prosperity? Is China doing it in order to wield influence and wield power and perhaps exclude others? And I think that's why the way in which China implements the One Belt, One Road policy will be something that will be very carefully watched by the international community in the years ahead.
You also mentioned in a recent column there is a strategic question for Americans as well, whether to, say, exclude others or having others or prosper.
My belief would be in an open internationalist policy. I think that international organizations should be open to all who are able to meet their terms. I think international policies should, in general, be directed at being more inclusive rather than being less inclusive. I would have preferred to see a world in which China was a part of the TPP and a world in which the United States was part of the AIIB. But that was not to be. And I hope that as the global system proceeds, it can do so in a way that is more inclusive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you have served in key economic policymaking positions in multiple governments, and in a recent column, you wrote here, I quote, "The financial history of the last 40 years demonstrate that often when real estate operators are thrilled about credit availability, financial crisis only a few years away." Given this housing kind of bubbly situation around the world in major cities, and here especially in China, what should be the right attitude towards the housing sector from the government or say the wider society?
I think China needs to look and think very carefully about its policies. I think that China faces quite possibly a very real set of trade-offs between, on the one hand, maintaining growth by supporting continuing investment, and on the other hand, allowing unsustainable imbalances to develop, which will lead to even greater interruptions of growth down the road. And so I look at some aspects of the valuation of real estate in China, and I look at some signs suggesting substantial commitment to building real estate, even in settings where it's not obvious who's going to buy the real estate. And I look at that with considerable concern.